The year is 2014. Everything was actually awesome. iPhones with Flappy Bird installed were being listed for $50,000, but that's none of my business, and Blumhouse turned heads after co-producing Unfriended, their first Screenlife horror film. Screenlife, otherwise known as computer screen films, are movies which are primarily told through the point of view of a computer screen, phone screen, or tablet screen, with no glimpse of the real world save for what's shown through the device's camera. The technique has garnered both a positive and negative reaction from moviegoers, with 2014's Unfriended being described by critics as superficial, trashy, and whiny, but also as subversive, ingenious, and innovative, with that final word, innovative, occasionally being used to describe the Screenlife technique as a whole. The fledgling technique is variously described as a method of filmmaking, subgenre, or a fully fledged genre in its own right. Naturally, for such a new development, there's not a whole lot of academic writing surrounding Screenlife, which makes any form of unanimous descriptive conventions difficult to agreeably pin down. It's often put in the same category as, or seen as an offshoot of, found footage, although I don't think this is a completely accurate comparison. The often amateurish and low-budget appearance of Screenlife films certainly resemble the appearance of many found footage films. However, the digital appearance and content of these films simulate something like an online live stream, rather than something you could have found on a lost camera in the woods. It takes the point of view nature of found footage and dials it up to 11, inviting the viewer to assume the role of the film's characters in a way more intimate than Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity ever could. So it was in 2014 that Screenlife technique was catapulted into the mainstream with the commercially successful Unfriended. However, this wasn't the first attempt to make a computer screen film, and followed numerous quieter, less successful experiments in the early noughties to bring the small screen to the big screen. And it would be harder to predict where this technique is heading without the context of where these methods first originated, and how they developed in what came before. "12 years before Unfriended graced the silver screen, the first true Screenlife film, The Collingswood Story, was released in 2002. Advertised as a revolutionary experiment in the supernatural, the film did manage to live up to its revolutionary claims, being the first ever feature film to keep its point of view entirely on a computer screen for the entirety of its brisk 82-minute runtime. The movie, however, also manages to live up to its experimental claims, as the film itself really isn't too great. Although, of course, it's easy to say this with the benefit of hindsight, and the movie's got to be commended for basically creating an entirely new technique on its own, but that doesn't really make up for the half-baked plot about cults, rituals, and dial-up mediums that culminates in a style-over-substance horror flick, where the scariest part is being reminded of how we all had to connect to the internet back in 2002. One thing that struck me about Collingswood after watching it was how much it reminded me of watching a basic stage performance. The majority of character interactions and shots in this movie are shot-reverse shot pieces of dialogue with no real variation. The locations are virtually unchanging the entire way through, and the techniques weren't yet developed enough to achieve any of the nuance that future Screenlife films would be able to take advantage of, because yes, Screenlife movies are capable of being nuanced. So, yes, you can call it revolutionary for being the first of its kind, but it also did little to sell the Screenlife technique as a legitimate method of filmmaking. In the decade from 2003 to 2013, there were very few efforts to engage with Screenlife, and at best, only hybrid movies were produced which combine elements of Screenlife with the much more popular found footage genre. The infamous Megan is Missing and The Den in 2011 and 2013 respectively are examples of these hybrid films. The segment titled The Sick Thing That Happened to Emily When She Was Younger from the 2012 anthology film VHS was also created using the Screenlife technique, and I think there was an episode of Victorious which dabbled in it too. The point is, there must have been little confidence that such a technique would have the legs to carry a feature-length film, and honestly, who could blame them? Obviously, things changed in 2014 with the release of Unfriended, a massive gamble, by the way, by a man who has since become known as the pioneer of Screenlife films, and who's been heavily involved with the continued development of the technique ever since. Timur Bekmambetov is a Russian-Kazakh filmmaker, director, producer, and screenwriter whose pre-Unfriended filmography includes 9, Apollo 18, and Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, all of which he produced and the latter of which he also directed. Since 2014, however, both Bekmambetov and his production company Basilev's Company have been best known for producing numerous Screenlife movies of different genres, pushing the boundaries of the types of stories which can be told through this technique. The first of these films, Unfriended, is a film which, for the current lack of any established terminology, I'd like to coin authentic screen life. By authentic screen life, what I mean is a film which is shown from one single point of view for its entire runtime. The borders of the computer screen are the permanent, unwavering borders of the film's world. Characters may full screen a video or minimize a window for emphasis, but the dimensions of the film never transition from these four fixed corners. This is in contrast to something like The Collingswood Story, which also plays from the point of view of a computer screen, but takes advantage of established cinematic and film techniques such as zooming, panning, and cutting, and thus I've coined cinematic screen life. I think the best way I can describe it is that authentic screen life is presented as though it's a screen recording, and cinematic screen life is presented as though it was filmed by a camera pointing at a computer screen. Although Baslev's company began this venture with authentic screen life, they've since produced numerous cinematic screen life movies as well. In 2018, the studio released 3 screen life movies, Searching, Profile, and a spiritual sequel to Unfriended subtitled Dark Web. The first of these movies, Searching, received largely positive reviews and, to me, is the most important screen life movie produced to date. Telling the story of a father searching for his missing daughter, the film sheds the stigmatic association of screen life with the horror genre and goes full hog into mystery thriller territory instead. Making full use of its presentation as a cinematic screen life film through multiple device POVs and an internet-spanning conspiracy, Searching fully justifies its computer screen appearance and, I think, is the movie which finally legitimized screen life as a real method of telling thrilling but also profound and moving stories grounded in reality and more relatable than just ghost haunts computer. This movie, as well as the 2018 follow-up to Unfriended, both showcase just how much character interactions and insight had developed since the shot-reverse-shot days of Collingswood's Story, with just as much being said about a person through actions like the hesitation before sending a text message, the suggestion of the same passwords being used across multiple online profiles, even something as slight as how the mouse moves across the screen tells us something about the character. The most mundane and daily websites for us, the audience, can become a treasure trove of information about the character that we're watching, as seeing how they post on Facebook or their diegetic Spotify playlist have the potential to make characters feel like real people with histories when executed well. So, although not the most mainstream method of filmmaking, screen life was in an interesting and largely positive position in 2018. In the 4 years since Unfriended, 7 screen life films were released, over half of which were produced by Baslev's company. The method was beginning to branch into new genres as well, and authentic and cinematic screen life were beginning to develop independently of each other. But then, we reached 2020, and for a brief moment, the world was put on hold. And then, the obvious happened. We're all aware, I think, I hope, of the effect that the COVID pandemic had on the film and cinema industry in 2020 and the continuing effects into the present day. In a period of physical isolation, we all witnessed firsthand the rise of online interactivity at a rate we'd probably never seen before. Work from home, school from home, play from home, pub quiz from home, Netflix party from home, filmmaking from home. While the big studios floundered to select new release dates for Bond and Black Widow, many independent filmmakers took advantage of the cinematic drought and used these new accessible technologies to make, really, one of the only kinds of films that can be made in a lockdown scenario. Screen life. The early 20s were something of a double-edged sword for screen life films. On one hand, recent screen life films during this period were far more accessible and more abundant than ever. Between 2020 and 2021, Host, Spree, Dashcam, See You Soon, Safer at Home, Deadware, Untitled Horror Movie, screen life films were being made at a rate that they had never been before. Not to mention the fact that these films were largely being released on streaming or video-on-demand services, making them immediately more accessible to anybody with an internet connection and a 90-minute attention span. Not all of these movies were hits now, and honestly most of them weren't, but the ones that did hit big. Such an example would be the Shudder original film Host, a screen life horror film released in mid-2020 that takes place entirely through Zoom for its runtime. As authentic screen life gets, it's full of nice visual touches. As far as cybernatural ghost stories go, it's definitely not the worst. The story involves a group of friends meeting over a Zoom call for their scheduled pandemic game night for one of our protagonists to invite her medium friend to perform a digital seance. When one of the friends doesn't take it seriously, she accidentally angers a demonic spirit who begins picking off the friends one by one. It's a ghost story as old as ghost stories, which is put into a fresh and entertaining context through its digital coat of paint. And critics and audiences both seem to agree. The film boasts an enviable 99% certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a very warm response from audiences. Many reviews for the film praised how the lockdown setting of the movie added an extra layer of claustrophobia to the events of the film, and how the horror of the film mimicked real-life lockdown fears and paranoia, with The Atlantic praising Host as, quote, the first great entry in the new genre of quarantine horror, end quote. And herein lies what I think is the other edge of the sword. Yes, the explosion of Screenlife films during the lockdown period made them more accessible to audiences, but this quarantine horror label seems worrying for the technique. Let me try to elaborate. Throughout this entire review, Screenlife by name is not mentioned once. What is mentioned? Found footage, a subgenre most strongly associated with horror films. Other, less favourable reviews of Host refer to the technique as a played-out gimmick, and a subgenre in a flood of lazy made-at-home productions that will be forgotten whenever things go back to some sort of normal. For a very young, flourishing film technique to be described in this way, as a superfluous subgenre of horror that can be disregarded as just an irksome gimmick, is concerning in a way. Especially given that 2 years prior, the technique proved it could do more than cyber horror with Searching, had critically acclaimed mystery, and to date, the most commercially successful Screenlife movie ever released. 2 years later, and despite being received well, Host is already being described as a gimmick horror movie. And keep in mind, this is just the beginning of 2020. Other movies would follow, Spree, Dashcam, and Safer at Home being 3 examples which received mixed to negative reviews for being shallow, for ruining the illusion, and again, for feeling gimmicky. And look, that's not to say that no one saw or enjoyed these films, plenty did, but for a style to go from being near unanimously praised for being slick, stylish and effective, to being regulated to just another gimmicky horror trope in just 2 years, it's concerning for a new technique that was just beginning to find its feet pre-pandemic. And it really makes one wonder about the future of the technique, and what it might hold. To be completely honest, it's difficult to predict the near future of Screenlife and how the technique will fare over the coming years. For such a polarizing method of filmmaking, still carving out its own identity, and often overshadowed by its much more popular, much more confident older cousin of found footage, it may be difficult to convince general audiences that the technique is anything more than a mid-2020s experiment at worst, and a pandemic-induced necessity at best. That's not to say that no attempts have been made, though. Earlier this year, a spiritual sequel to Searching, entitled Missing, was released, another attempt by Baslev's company to break Screenlife free of its stigmatic association with found footage horror, especially post-lockdown. Missing treads similar ground to its standalone predecessor, being a missing family member mystery story with just enough melodrama and plot twists to remain entertaining throughout. It's received a generally positive response and has made a fairly respectable return in the box office, making back its relatively large Screenlife budget of $7 million, fivefold at the time of writing this video. Although the film has been received warmly, even positive reviews are pointing out a growing feeling of fatigue with computer screen films. As an example, The Guardian's review for Missing notes that while the movie's use of Screenlife is genuinely innovative at times, the film also may not be strong enough for the subgenre at large to return, even noting earlier in the review that the declining enthusiasm for Screenlife in general, noting that in the 5 years since Searching, what was predicted to be a, quote, big trend in cinema ultimately amounted to little more than a, quote, tiny blip instead. And this notion of Screenlife fatigue, of wearing novelty, is echoed across the internet. Reviews from audiences and critics, positive and negative, largely share this shared sentiment of what's the point? Whether this reaction can be chalked up to an audience interest outgrowing Screenlife in general, the question remains, how does Screenlife stay relevant? Or, more accurately, can it? As things stand now, the technique's best hope still lies with the studio that first popularised it, Baslev's company. To date, the studio has released 5 Screenlife films, with most of the movies having a low budget of just around $1 million. A box office of just $10 million would yield a tenfold return, and the majority of these films have made big returns, so it's not like audiences aren't seeing them. The question is now how to maintain any momentum going forward. Recently, following the release of Unfriended Dark Web, Bekmambetov signed a 5-film deal with Universal to produce Screenlife films of varying genres, which may be the way forward if Screenlife is to shed its tiring association with horror films. In 2022, sources reported that Bekmambetov was collaborating with Ice Cube to develop a science fiction Screenlife film. It may sound like a hard sell, but this is the man with 4 financially successful Screenlife films under his belt in 2 entirely separate genres, so I think it's worth giving him the benefit of the doubt to continue. Which honestly might be what Screenlife as a whole needs. The benefit of the doubt. Throughout this entire video, I've been very careful to refer to Screenlife as a technique or a method rather than as a genre or a gimmick. For me, Screenlife lies somewhere in the middle, a contemporary new technique just waiting for an opportunity to fully define itself. Don't get me wrong now, it's not the next step in cinematic evolution. It's a young method of filmmaking which was just beginning to find its footing before being prematurely stunted in the early 20s to end up largely disregarded as just another short-lived experiment in horror when it really has so much more to offer. We've already seen this in Baslev's company's non-horror outings. This is a technique which has already proven its capacity to tell real stories, enough that it deserves a shot, a final shot, to grow beyond its stigma as a gimmicky horror trope. And maybe Missing is the first step in this, maybe not, but it's telling that the studio's first outing in 5 years isn't a horror, the genre best associated with Screenlife, but a mystery that harkens back to Searching, in this Gene's opinion, the finest Screenlife film ever made. The film that showed that Screenlife was articulate enough to have genuinely moving, shocking and emotional moments, flexible enough to boast 2 distinctive filmmaking styles and, if the future stars align, developed enough to one day maybe be considered film's newest genre.